الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله حقا لا إله إلا اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله عز وجل فقد أمرنا الله بذلك في القرآن المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. We begin on this blessed day of Friday, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, praising Him, seeking His assistance, seeking His forgiveness. We are fully convinced that one who is guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can never be misguided, and one who is in need of guidance cannot be guided except by Allah Most High. And we seek refuge in Allah Most High from the evil whispers of our own souls. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send His peace and blessings and prayers upon the last and final messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And I remind myself and my brothers and sisters of the duty to have taqwa, to be God conscious, about which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, O you who believe, be conscious of Allah as He deserves that you be conscious of Him. وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ, and do not pass away except that you are in a state of submission. Indeed, in these last several months, no public gathering has occurred in the Muslim community without beginning with a dua for our brothers and sisters, not only in Gaza, West Bank, and Rafah, but around the world, who are being oppressed and experiencing any form of injustice or oppression. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indeed liberate them and grant them relief. The topic today is positioning the seminary, Qalam as we know it, in the context of the history of Islam in America and as a mechanism to indeed successfully transfer our faith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran gave us comprehensive guidance, and in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in the generations that followed, we understood very quickly that this religion of ours is sustained, of course, from the guidance that is given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but that He inspires people throughout different generations to establish institutions that ultimately help us to not only learn about our faith, to practice our faith, and inshallah transmit that faith to coming generations. It is therefore not the concern of a Muslim only to think about the intergenerational transfer of wealth, which is something which much more is talked about in modern society. What are you leaving for your family? Have you planned for your retirement? All of these things are very valid concerns. Never get me wrong on that point. But in the Quran, when you look to see what is being prioritized, what is the concern that's being prioritized, you find out very quickly just in one part of the Quran, and there are many examples as well, when you look into the life of Yaqub alayhi salam, and then a particular scenario that is unfolding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us into what could be said is a living area of Yaqub alayhi salam. And he, as we know, is the Prophet of Allah. He is the son of a Prophet of Allah. He is the grandson of the Prophet of Allah. And he is the father of the Prophet of Allah. So you have the son Yusuf alayhi salam, the father Ishaq alayhi salam, the grandfather Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now he is going to pass away, as are all of us. He is going to pass away. He is the Prophet, son of a Prophet, grandson of a Prophet, father of a Prophet. What would he ask of his children? What would he ask of his children? If any of us were blessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to receive a phone call, say maybe you can FaceTime, or here you can actually talk, or here you should rush to the hospital, your loved one has a few minutes left. If they're a mother or father, what might they say to us? They may say, "Forgive me for any mistakes that I made as your parent." They may say, "Remember that I wanted to take care of you, and this is as much as I could provide. I'm sorry I didn't provide more," whether it was a house or a car or education or marriage or whatever dunya-wise might be on their mind. Yaqub alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the verse says, "Id kuntum shuhada, id hadara Yaqub al-maut." Were you present, were you witnesses when death approached Yaqub alayhi salam? "Id qala li banihi," he says to all of his sons gathered. He's asking them only one thing. What will you worship after me? Can you imagine that? Who are we compared to Yaqub alayhi salam? Son of a prophet, father of a prophet, grandson of a prophet, and he's about to die. And his only concern is, I want to make sure before I return to Allah, what are you going to worship after me? And of course, alhamdulillah, they respond, we will worship your Lord, ilahaka, your Lord, and the Lord of your father. And then they specify, in case there's any confusion, Ibrahim wa Ismail wa Ishaq, and then they specify Tawheed, that is the one true Lord. This is the guidance that we are being given in the Quran. This is again someone who is already accorded the status of a prophet. We, who are human beings without such status, trying to be husbands and wives and fathers and mothers and in-laws to one another, all of us are trying to do the same thing, trying to see how best we can learn about the religion, practice the religion, and transmit indeed the faith to the coming generations. So when you think about this, you start to realize Qalam Institute, Qalam Seminary, is essentially that. It's a mechanism. Educational institutions throughout the history of Islam have been mechanisms for the successful, inshallah, transmission of faith across generations. Across generations. Lest anyone think it is limited and just saying, well, it's worship. Well, worship, of course, alhamdulillah, comes in so many forms, and in fact, it is the essence of our existence. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. There is no reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He uses وَمَا, it's like وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةٌ لِلْعَالَمِينَ to the Prophet ﷺ. There is no reason No reason for us to create and send a prophet of Allah unless his arrival in this dunya, on this earth, is a source of mercy, the actual manifestation in living out mercy across all of creation. And indeed you find in this case Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, there's no reason for me to create you, or the jinn for that matter, except that you understand that your purpose here is to worship. So we tell our children to perfect their salah, to perfect their siyam and their fasting, to perfect, of course, as they will get older and earn their own income and be eligible to pay zakah and to perform the hajj, all of the arkan of all of these different aspects of obligation. But ultimately, that purpose of worship and being alive, the whole idea is captured in another verse, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُقِي مَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. That indeed my prayer and my sacrifice, right? My living and my dying. There's no other reason. And that's why the confusion is coming again and again and again, in a time and a space of a genocide being live streamed in front of our eyes. If everybody isn't calling this an all hands moment, to go out there and advocate and protest and to call the congressional people, all of that is there. All of that is there because those are human mechanisms. But in our religion, knowing where we place Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the one in charge, we understand that when He says that not a single tribulation or trial will touch you, إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا, except what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written for us, was what He has already, as the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But some may be mistaken, because if you are out there protesting, and alhamdulillah, I visited a couple of the encampments, they established the Fajr prayer. Because if we're out there protesting, calling the congressional offices, calling the White House, staying up all night, discussing what is the solution to all this, and then Fajr comes and we miss it, what have we done? We have completely violated the essence of the purpose, which was to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even when we advocate for all of these things, our religion again is telling us to transmit something to our children, which is what? That who is in charge? Who is in charge? No matter what they gather against you, who is in charge? And it was said to the Quraysh, you remember, then armies are gathered against you. الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسِ إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ. It was said to them that the armies have gathered against you. فَخْشَوْهُمْ, which is what? To essentially crumble out of the fear of this army that has been gathered against you. But what happens to the believers? Again, documented in the Quran. Again, we have to transmit this to the coming generations. The believers say what? What happens to them? فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَ اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. Because if that's not what's coming out of our mouths, if we can say with conviction to our children, with yaqeen to say to them, that you may advocate, you may protest, you may go out there and do all these things, but never for a second think that human institutions are in charge. That human institutions will ever be satisfying to you in the outcome. We will turn to the UN, but to hold it accountable, not to rely on it. We will turn to our government, but not to rely on it, but to try to hold it accountable, and so on and on and on. So, if we're transferring this to our children, they need to see us in the middle of the worst of difficulty, whether at the individual level, by the way, whether at the individual level or at the family and societal level, to constantly be repeating what? That hasbunallah, Allah is sufficient for us. Second part of it, وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ, that indeed He is the best disposer of our affairs. And this has to be done in a conscientious and indeed consistent manner. So in the second part, inshallah, today, we will talk about what is it that we are attempting to do. What is it that we're trying to transmit? And at least 3 themes stand out, and inshallah, we will try to address those. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروا إنه غفور رحيم. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulullah, inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi, ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, sallu alayhi wa salliman tasliman. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad wa barik sallim. Qalam Seminary began as Qalam Institute in the most humble of means. Small campus in Arlington, Texas here, and subhanAllah, it has grown to what it has become today. When we benefit from it, when we benefit from such an institution, from the vision of its founders, we bring to mind that inshallah, through the training of these young men and women, we are now filling the gap, a gap for which we didn't plan. This hijrah, and I'm a student of the community, the development of the Muslim community in America, this hijrah to the West is by far the most unplanned migration in the history of Islam. There's never been a situation where a group of people or an individual just decided to randomly start to migrate to another land without consulting scholars and saying, when we get there, how will we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When we get there, what should be the first thing we should do and establish? And because of that, it was very late that we started even developing Islamic schools. And some may say it was so late that we paid attention to our priorities that we're still having communities raising money and looking for land to bury our dead. We didn't even plan to die in this land. And yet, there can be a recovery. We can reverse things and move forward, inshallah, with the deliberate speed. And one of those things is to focus on education. And indeed, the education itself cannot be just the idea of teaching without doing a few things, and these three themes stand out. Number one, education, in addition to teaching about the basics of the religion, is ultimately about teaching our young men and women to have upright character. Because at the end of this, none of it will matter. For so long, we played with identity politics, and we said, and representation politics. So if we can just train our kids to be leaders, and they can be out there, and somebody can hire them in companies, and they can be visibly Muslim, and they can be at the table, and they can be this, and they can be that. Well, identity got us this far, representation got us this far, but when a genocide was taking place, it seemed that none of that actually mattered. None of that actually mattered. So it pushes us now to say what? It means that the character has to be upright. Alayhi salatu wassalam is sent to us, right? وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةٌ لِلْعَالَمِينَ. That's one characteristic, is mercy. إِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. That indeed you have been created on the most noble of character. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that's one thing throughout the history of humanity. Not just the people who lived with him, who were his Sahaba, but also the people who came after. Not one person can find a single instance where there's even a remote question, let alone a blemish, upon the noble character of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A lifetime spent building that character. So we have to turn to our children. We have to help them understand. Whatever path they choose, whatever career they choose, whatever, even if you say to them that if you only spent the rest of your life studying, it will not matter if your character is not upright. Because we have situations where spiritual abuse takes place. The person had all the knowledge. They had memorized the Quran. They had graduated in maybe the top universities, Islamic universities. And yet, it did not keep them from committing an offense against either their families or the students left in their charge. So we have to think about this. We have to think about what is the outcome of an education institution. And I can tell you without any doubt that alhamdulillah, so far, and may Allah continue to protect the seminary and all of its graduates, that so far everyone being placed in different communities around the country, whether as youth directors, whether as assistant or associate imams, or the actual religious director in some cases of the masajid, are upholding this major principle, which is upright character, as a result of having studied the religion formally. Number two, it is that we have to transmit to our children a life of service. And this, if nothing else, is going to be the difference in America. That we are going to be asked, and people are already asking, and they will always ask us. You were not in the streets for example, internationally speaking, when the Uyghurs are still in concentration camps. You didn't go to the streets for the Rohingya brothers and sisters. You didn't really go to the streets when black men, mostly young men, were being killed in the streets. You didn't go to the streets to protest unemployment and underemployment, uninsured and underinsured. You didn't go to the streets, so what was it? So what was it? I have taken to apologizing and saying we tried and we'll do better. We'll never turn back. We'll only go forward. If we couldn't do something then, we will inshallah do it now, and we won't turn back. But we can't now stop doing what we're doing because there's a genocide actually in progress, and we must do everything to stop it. So how does service come about? If you look at the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, those first 40 years, the instances where they are documented, where his life is documented, are things where he interacted with others, where his character came out, and it was usually upon service. It was usually upon service. He is of service by his character. As-Sadiqul Amin is the title given to him. The tribes are fighting. The black stone must be replaced after the reconstruction, renovation, if you will, of the Kaaba. And the dua, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers their dua. He sends him to be of service to establish justice among them, to establish an environment in which they will not fight. And he brings about a solution. He is of service to everyone around him. And even, subhanAllah, this continues after Nubuwwah, after becoming the Prophet of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Where is our community, where is our family in the context of service? Why are so many of our organizations struggling, Masajid included, with just a few people whose backs are breaking, doing all of the programming, all of the services, sacrificing their personal life, their personal health, their personal careers, personal family life, because all of us are consumers on autopilot, just happy, and even bad consumers in the sense that we criticize when things aren't done well, but we won't dare lift a finger to say, why don't my family and I show up and set up for Taraweeh half an hour before everybody else? Why don't we take some time during the last 10 nights instead of the same people, and we make dua for them. May Allah bless you for all of what you're doing, but nobody actually gets up to roll away the carpets, to clean up after the suhoor, and to establish a life of service. Even if every family once a month for 1 hour said, we want to come and serve, how can you use us? Believe me, it would transform the landscape. And I don't mean just serving Muslims. I mean being at the food bank. I mean being at the shelters, serving the unhoused. I mean being there when it actually matters, not being there for the likes and the shares because now Muslims are in a negative light. So maybe if we show up and serve, they might, no, that's not going to work. It's just a life of service, genuine life of service. Genuine life of service. Why did the Prophet ﷺ walk with the elderly lady who wanted to leave town because of what he was preaching, carrying her bags to the outskirts of the city? Why did he carry and just take all of the, in modern language, bashing that she was doing of this guy who was preaching this religion without once letting her know who he was? Service, khidmah. His beloved wife Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha says about him, كَانَ فِي مَهْنَةِ أَوْ خِدْمَةِ أَهْلِهِ. Who was he? How was his time spent? She said, who knew him the best, that he was in the service of his family, of course, except prayer times when delegations arrived or if there was other business to be taken care of. If we transmit this to our children, along with the basics of the religion, a love for upright character and service, believe me, not a single person, even the worst of the worst, to attack our religion, attack our Quran, attack the life of the beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, will ever just be tolerated. They will be shut down because every person will say, the Muslims I know, their children get up and they shovel the snow of the driveways of the elders in the community. The children I know inquire about their neighbors during thunderstorms and floods and when the power goes out. The Muslims I know come and inquired during the pandemic if I needed groceries and if I'm okay. And when they saw the announcement of a birth or a graduation, they sent good well wishes and they made prayers. These are the Muslims I know. You think anyone is going to challenge that narrative? If this is truly the way we live. And then last but not least, the theme of dua. The theme of dua. Ibrahim alayhi salam makes dua, but he makes dua for his progeny. وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِهِ. He's not satisfied. You're saying this for me, Ya Rab, but what about the generations that will come after me? The generations who are coming after me, we are that generation. Sitting in Carrollton, sitting in Texas, sitting in America, we are those generations. The answer to that dua. The answer of the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, the answer to the dua, indeed, as Dr. Suleiman Niang, Allah yarhamhu, who is a scholar of African studies in America, who said that maybe you are making all of these institutions. Maybe you are living in America this life that you're living because the answer of just one of the enslaved who ran into the plantations of Mississippi, of Georgia, of Louisiana, of Alabama, of Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and they were 1 out of 4 from the records show were Muslims. And just one of them raised their hands in the darkness, a woman or a man who was Muslim by birth, and said, "Oh Allah, if they kill me and I'm unable to worship you and transmit this religion to those that come after me, Ya Rab, replace me with the people who will come to this land, or at least become Muslim in this land and worship you." Doesn't that humble you? Doesn't that humble you to think that maybe we are the answer to that dua, or make it closer? Maybe we are the answer to the dua of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our parents themselves, our uncles and aunts, our grandparents, and so forth. And indeed, that dua, part of that dua is Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. Is to keep telling our children to keep repeating this, to understand the religion. Ida asabathum musiba is saying in the Quran. This is not a saying you say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. The religion is wide. This is not a saying upon death. Yes, you say that because that is the biggest of trials. But every musibah, everything, even when the child gets a small nick in the finger from falling or scrapes their knee, teach them to say first, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That I am from my Lord, and to my Lord is my return. Why? Because we think a small cut on the lip, a scrape of the knee, these is just something that could pass. No. If it leads to an infection, and the infection worsens, there's nothing on earth anyone could do if that's how Allah had willed, that's how we would live. Humbling. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. Reading Ayatul Kursi after every salah and asking Allah for protection. Making the adhkar at night before the children go to sleep. We are literally trying to raise an entire generation who will inshallah exceed us in the learning of the religion, practice of the religion, and inshallah in the love of this religion. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indeed give us the best in this world and in the akhirah. Allahumma ya Allah, ya dal jalali wal kamali wal ikram. Allahumma a'izz al-Islam wal Muslimin. Allahumma ansur Islam wal Mujahideen fi kulli makan. Ya Azizu, Ya Jabbar, Ya Karimu, Ya Ghaffar. اللهم اغفر لنا ولوالدينا اللهم اغفر لنا صغيرنا وكبيرنا وحينا وميتنا وشاهدنا وغائبنا وذكرنا وأنثانا يا رب العالمين. اللهم أصلح قلوبنا أصلح أعمالنا واستر عيوبنا واغفر ذنوبنا وأحسن خاتماتنا يا رب العالمين. ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم اشفي مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين. اللهم اشفي مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين. اللهم اشفي مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين. وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. أقيموا الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
Straighten your line, inshallah, and fill the gaps. Focus on your prayers. Make dua for yourselves, your families, Muslims here. and around the world. Allahu Akbar. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. ولا تكونوا كالذين نسوا الله فأنساهم أنفسهم أولئك هم الفاسقون. لا يستوي أصحاب النار وأصحاب الجنة أصحاب الجنة هم الفائزون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصديا من خشية الله وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون. هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم. هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون. هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. Before the formal announcements, inshallah, I just wanted to say thank you to Qalam Institute and Sheikh Abdul Nasir Jangda, of course, the founder, for mashallah, this beautiful facility. I was ashamed that I had not visited the facility after we had discussed acquiring it, but it's so beautiful to come and see it. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to indeed bless not only the founders and the staff and the students now, but those to come in the future, inshallah. May Allah, again, bless those who are behind the Qalam Institute. And over to Hafid Abdul.